Today's subject matter experts examine how incorporating ESG considerations can enhance your supply chain's resilience and sustainability. We'll explore how prioritizing environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and strong governance practice can not only mitigate risks, but also foster long-term success in today's interconnected business landscapes. Join us as we navigate the evolving landscape of ESG and its impact on global supply chains. First of all, I'd like to say welcome to our subject matter experts. And if we can, let's introduce them in order. So I'll go for Melissa, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and the organization that you work with.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Michelle. So I am Alyssa Reddy, and I lead on risk and sustainability at BT Sourced. I am based in Dublin in Ireland. My key focus is on responsible sourcing, managing impacts and risks across our global supply chain, and working together with our suppliers and stakeholders to contribute to a more sustainable world. I completed my master's in science degree specializing in environmental management, and I have over 20 years of experience regarding governance, strategic planning, assurance, and managing environmental, human rights, safety and health risks in both the private and public sector.
Wow, welcome. Thank you very much. And Alyssa, if I could introduce yourself, please.
My name is Alyssa Caddle, and I work for Thermo Fisher Scientific. We are a large Fortune 100 life sciences, biotechnology, pharma company with over 200 manufacturing sites all over the world. My role here at Thermo Fisher is the director of our supplier responsibility program. So as part of the global sustainability function, I sit alongside and work alongside our global procurement function. And like Melissa, my focus areas include decarbonizing the supply chain, as well as working on responsible sourcing and human rights due diligence in the supply chain. I have originally a background in engineering. I've been working in various facets of corporate sustainability for over 15 years now in the tech sector, in the apparel supply chain, and now here in the life sciences.
Thank you. And Lazar.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Lazar Armano. I head up EcoVadis in Northern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm based in London, and I've been with EcoVadis for just over 7 years. The vast majority of my role is around expanding our presence in the regions that I oversee. My background is specifically in sustainability, in sales, and responsible procurement. And I'm very happy to be here today.
So on Monday, it was World Earth Day, and on June 5th, it's World Environmental Day. What do either of those mean to you and to your organizations? And Lazar, I'll start with you.
We live in a world where environment, sustainability, various aspects of sustainability are top of mind of pretty much every single individual. Or if they're not, they are becoming slowly but surely top of mind. We live in a way where we can't ignore any further our impact on the environment, our impact on individuals that we interact with, on various nations, countries, as well as on, well, how we interact with people. World Earth Day kind of is a reminder of that. We must be respectful of the environment that we live in, and respectful of the individuals that we interact with. And it's quite similar for the organization that I work for. EcoVadis's role really is to inject the topic of environment, but also of sustainability into the procurement dialogue, into procurement as a function, and really put in place a very specific way of organizations interacting with each other and discussing with each other how the environment, labor and human rights, ethics form part of a discussion and form part of doing business. So I believe that's what that means to me and to EcoVadis as a company.
Absolutely, and thank you. I do appreciate that. And if I take from that, and Alyssa, I'll talk to you, with the organization like Thermo, who are a global organization with multiple ERP solutions, with multiple different supply chains, what does world environment or Earth Day mean to Thermo Fisher and to yourself?
Yeah, we have a really large and really complex business. Certainly, you've alluded to some of the technical complexities, but also keep in mind we have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees globally around the world. And so Earth Day is really an opportunity to make sure that those colleagues are also aware and engaged in our efforts and feel like they understand how they contribute towards our sustainability goals. So it's a moment to celebrate, of course, the success of the company, but also to drive awareness and engagement with those colleagues who may feel like they're not so clear yet on how sustainability is relevant to their job. And so it's a great opportunity for us to make sure we're amplifying the work that we're doing and that we're getting people plugged in so they realize how they can contribute and participate in meeting our sustainability goals as well.
Perfect. And Melissa, I'm really excited because BT are always very conscious and aware of, looking after the planet, what they can do as individuals and as an organization. Can you tell me what BT, because I'm sure they're planning something because they always do, what did we do for World Earth Day and what your view is of that as a whole?
So for us, it means a lot, and it's about creating that awareness, educating and supporting everyone around us, and making a difference where possible, like throughout our entire value chain. And overall, it's about us needing to change our consumption habits and getting that through to everyone, consuming less, choosing products with lower environmental impacts, reducing our footprint of day-to-day activities, making these informed choices. And then also in terms of our supply chain, like buying from more sustainable and local sources, reducing the consumption of plastics, and practice recycling, refurbishing, and reuse where possible as well.
And I think what I've taken from that, from the three of you, is education and the importance of educating our employees, our suppliers, etc., of just what ESG is, what it means to individuals, and also what it means to countries, because there is lots of global standards that we all know, and basically what it's helping to generations going forward. So I'm really glad that all of you have that very similar viewpoint. And to delve into that a little bit further, and Lazar, if you don't mind, I'll point this question at you. Could you explain the concept of sustainability in the context of businesses and supply chains, and why you feel that it is now a crucial consideration in global economy supply chains?
Sure, I'll attempt to do that because sustainability ultimately means different things to different individuals, different things to different companies. You speak with organizations in various sectors, and for some, within sustainability, the environmental aspect will matter more, or be more material to the operations that they have. To others, it may be biodiversity, it may be animal welfare. To others, it could be diversity and inclusion. To others, it could be bribery and corruption, and the list goes on. So sustainability has become a bit of a sort of an all-encompassing term to look at various aspects that are connected to responsibility, really. Responsibility towards the planet, responsibility towards individuals, and responsibility in terms of standards we uphold when we do business, ethics, very, very specifically there. And so what's happened really over the last sort of, not few years, I would say a couple of decades, but most importantly over the last few sort of 3 to 5 years, is that the topic of sustainability has risen on the agenda of executives within organizations, C-level executives. More and more of these C-level executives, sometimes it's CEOs, sometimes it's CFOs, sometimes it's chief procurement officers, CIOs. A lot of the work that they do is linked to sustainability, or they are sometimes even rewarded for more responsible practices within those teams, within those organizations. And that's coming from various factors. One is there's more and more regulation related to sustainability, asking organizations to do more, to demonstrate what they have in place, not just within their company, but within their supply chain, because they have a massive impact there. Another is related to investment. More and more investors want to see what organizations are doing and how they're acting responsibly as they produce their products, as they deliver their services, and as they engage with third parties in order to provide those products or services. But also important to note is the younger generations, millennials, Gen Z now. They don't want to be associated with brands, to work for companies that don't demonstrate very high standards on sustainability. And for some, as I said at the beginning, various aspects will matter more than others, labor and human rights or the environment. And it's because of that, because of all these factors coming together, that indeed the topic of sustainability has risen on the agenda of companies and of individual executives within those.
And if I can take from that, and Alyssa, from your perspective, as a compliance officer for a sourcing organization that sources products globally, one of the things that I always get very concerned about, and Lazar mentioned it there, is, global regulations. What do you see are some of those unique challenges or opportunities that you encounter today within your organization?
So in general, what we see is that laws are trying to go after similar concepts, but sometimes the details can be different, or the ways that they expect a business to go in and identify risk, as an example, or very specific tactics for addressing those risks may be different from law to law. So what we are striving to do at Thermo Fisher is, where possible, generate global processes that have that regional nuance that meets the expectations of, where possible, as many of these supply chain due diligence regulations as possible, because we want to focus on getting the impact right. We don't want to focus on being so specific for each of our legal entities that we lose sight of the big picture, which is really understanding where are the challenges or risks in our supply chain, and how do we engage those suppliers that represent that risk population to make sure that they have strong management systems in place. At the end of the day, almost all of these laws are put in place with that concept in mind. So whenever laws align to, global corporate standards, things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or other frameworks that are kind of globally accepted, it helps companies to execute at scale and spend more of our time, money, and resources on really trying to solve for the challenges in the supply chain, versus getting very, very concerned with the details of one specific regulation or another. And so that's what we're looking to do, and we're looking for tools and services that give us that flexibility and that context to, wherever possible, design that kind of global best fit process.
And Melissa, if I go further on that, so there's lots of regulations, and by the way, and I'll talk to Melissa on that, there's lots of regulations, and it's changing at a rapid pace as well. Do you think sometimes multinational companies are focused on complying to regulations so much that they're actually, foregoing what it is we're trying to achieve as an organization, and as Earth users at the end of the day, to ensure that we're aligning with sustainability, etc.?
I think sometimes organizations can get caught up in the, the reporting side of things, the details, and not just actually focusing on the bigger picture. And there's so much right now that's happening in terms of the ESG, in terms of the regulatory landscape. And I think if we just focus on what stakeholder expectations are, and keeping ourselves up to date, and also just trying to focus, as Alyssa said, on the impact side of things. I mean, what can we do in terms of just making a difference? And as a company, how do we comply, and then ensure that we meet our stakeholder expectations as well? For example, BT, we're a really big organization, and for us it's important because we are seen as a leader, and we can influence, encourage other organizations to also progress on their commitments on sustainability as well. So the more people I think big organizations reach out to, the bigger the impact we can all have together, and then the more people we can enable to contribute to a sustainable world. But also at the same time, don't just get caught up in the details around it, but try and focus on that impact, that bigger impact that you want to make.
I think that's a beautiful statement from both of you. And I think that's where I find challenges all the time is there are so many companies that are focused on what do we need to do? What is law? What is legal? And then they're forgetting about their own internal processes and what it is they're trying to achieve as well. So I really appreciate that. Lazar, not just sustainability, another one that we're fighting every single day is climate emissions. I've seen some changes that have happened based on the Swiss that happened where some people actually were suing their own country. So climate emissions are definitely a geopolitical change at the moment. Where do you think we need to fight against climate change? How can companies effectively measure them? How can countries even effectively measure, and what are EcoVadis doing around that area?
Yeah, so you use a good example indeed. That was groundbreaking. It was the European Court of Human Rights case that was won against Switzerland. That is something new, and there's likely to be more of that coming. The truth is, we are seeing the impact of climate change, of emissions going up. As you've seen, some of the summers are a bit unusual. Some of the springs currently here in the UK are also a little bit unusual. So we're all seeing the impact of that. What's interesting is that because we're seeing the impact, organizations want to do more very, very quickly. So much more that it's actually not possible to do everything that quickly. To give you an example, at the moment, especially in certain parts of the world, companies have a very good grasp of what their own carbon footprint is, of what their own emissions are, their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so they're focusing a lot more attention on scope 3. What are the emissions of their suppliers? Because the vast majority of these companies, the biggest percentage of their emissions is in the supply chain, often 80, 90% plus. And so they want to almost replicate the good practices that they have within their own companies in the supply chain. So ideally, they would want very good data from their suppliers, a very good carbon footprint that is as accurate as possible. But the truth is the vast majority of organizations out there don't have the capabilities to report a good carbon footprint because they can't measure it appropriately. They don't have necessarily that maturity or that understanding of what carbon actually is. And so what we're seeing as a company, as EcoVadis in this space and how we're trying to help out is really to work with organizations to, first of all, make them realize that when they engage suppliers, less mature companies on the topic of carbon, they need to kind of meet them at the level that they are and start to have an engagement on that topic to begin with, sometimes starting from the very basics. What is carbon? Do you know that the electricity that you consume, that the fuel that you consume, that is actually carbon? A lot of companies still don't know that. In many parts of the world, they can't even get an electricity bill. So where do you actually start? And where do you start in order not to overwhelm an organization that will ultimately, ideally, help you reduce your carbon footprint? So there are targets to reduce carbon footprints. There is a lot of energy being put behind looking at scope 3, behind looking at emissions in the supply chain, but the expectations are at this point in time potentially a little bit too high. So you have to start with the engagement piece. Start with having a conversation about that topic with organizations that are not mature so that in 12 months' time, 24 months' time, you can actually get them to a stage where they can measure their own carbon footprint and work with you to reduce that and therefore have a lower impact on the planet. That's what we're seeing really in this space.
So, Melissa, I'm going to go back to you. So for small companies, right, companies that are, 2 or 3 different people on them, how are they taking this challenge up? Because they may not even have the resources to measure this or to even have the opportunities to be educated. How are BT innovating that story to get to those smaller suppliers to ensure that they're also adhering to the regulations?
So currently, we are right now in discussions around this with our small suppliers and how we can actually engage them and help them and support them in terms of their commitments to net zero. So I think that the whole awareness piece is very important for us. But I think going into the future, we definitely going to have a lot more focus on this. I know that the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, is a big one. And like just helping like really small companies just to unpack the SDGs, and then from the SDGs like trying to pick out like what can they align with and how can they contribute more to the SDGs as well. But yeah, I think that's a really good question, Michelle. I think a lot more companies can focus like on the really small suppliers as well, because I think in general we try to focus on the really big emitters and the big suppliers, and we somehow forget about the really small suppliers.
Yeah, and low tier is always a concern for me. It's just how are we managing them? Because at the end of the day, if we don't manage and support them, then so many of these businesses just will not be able to continue. And Alyssa, from a Thermo Fisher perspective, I know you've put a lot of strategies in place to align that education, that verification and validation. I know working with the likes of EcoVadis, could you really present to us how you've been doing that for some of your lower tier suppliers?
Sure. So I'll maybe adjust the question a tiny bit, if that's okay, just to talk about a few segments of our tier one, because today the focus is still for us a lot in that tier one supply chain, with the theory of change being we educate and enable our tier one, then they will have similar discussions with their suppliers, and this cascade will continue through. And so what we've done in the kind of human rights space is a dual segmentation approach. So we've looked really at what suppliers are most important to us. So where we have large spend relationships, strategic key suppliers, single source suppliers, things like that. And then where in the supply population do we believe the largest inherent risk to human rights and the environment lies? So just generally, regardless of our size of our relationship, where can we indicate places, particular industries or particular geographies that we think present an outsized risk? And in both of those populations, we're very active in engaging those suppliers through the EcoVadis platform, as an example, to understand how are they managing and what do their management systems look like today, and are they sufficient such that the inherent risk is well mitigated and well managed, or perhaps do they need support, education, corrective action to go on that continuous improvement journey to get where we need them to be? Because certainly we want to source globally, we want to source competitively, and we want to source with people that are committed to that continuous improvement journey. So that's where we're kind of investing in, from a segmentation perspective, in engagement with the suppliers. And then on the climate side, we have done a lot of work over the past 2 years to really identify that what are the key suppliers that make up the largest portion of our scope 3 or our value chain emissions. So if we can size this a little bit, right? Say you have tens of thousands of suppliers in your supply chain, the 80 to 90% of your emissions probably comes from that top couple thousand at most. And for some companies with a more consolidated supply chain, that might be even just the top couple hundred. So we see that as well. And this is where they might be big to you, but to Melissa's point, they may be a small or medium enterprise. So they may need different support than a large company who might act as both a peer and a supplier, and they may have their own robust programs in place. So within that top segment that represents our largest emitters, we now have sub-segmented to understand, are there particular geographies where they're going to need extra support or different resources? Are there certain business types like small, medium businesses that might need different education, training, or climate literacy? Are there particular segments of that population that might be heavily driven by electricity, as an example? So getting them access to renewable electricity might be a really fast path to decarbonization, versus where do we have sectors that are really carbon intensive and they're going to need a longer runway to decarbonization. And then putting in the suite of tools to meet them where they are, as Lazar mentioned, and whether that's generating an environmental policy for the first time, baselining their emissions for the first time, setting a target that's in alignment with science-based expectations, or actually going out and driving some projects to actually convert away from fossil fuels, which at the end of the day is what we're all trying to do here. We can meet them where they are on that journey.
Alyssa, by the way, that's really fascinating, because I didn't even know that organizations could do that. So that must take up quite a lot of resources, to actually create mitigation plans, review them, put them on the right targets, etc. if I took that and I looked at supply chain transparency around ninth degree suppliers, how can you ensure that your direct suppliers are ensuring all their ninth are meeting those requirements as well?
Yeah, I think this is where we, in our segment, our sector, we have room to grow. But one of the things that we're actively exploring is how is AI going to help us enable that so that, if you have tens of thousands in your tier 1, then you likely have millions in your tier 3, and the whole world's in by tier N, right? So knowing that it's probably not meaningful to try to engage with all those, can we use capabilities within AI to do mapping for us, to identify where those relationships may result in an adverse impact or particular risk? So that's what we're hopeful. We've done a few pilots there, and I think that there is a lot more work to do to really unlock and say, where is our time, energy, and influence best spent, right? Because we are investing and we are willing to go down the path with suppliers and help them achieve what we're looking to achieve. But our influence is much better placed in certain places in the supply chain than others. So I think we want to spend that time and effort where we think we can make the largest difference, and we want to understand how we can use analytics to find those hotspots so that we don't have to, quote unquote, boil the ocean.
And Lazar, how are EcoVadis helping the likes of BT or Thermo or organizations to do that today?
We can support organizations in identifying areas of improvement, and then really act as a platform to enable that. At the core of what we do is really assessing companies on their sustainability credentials, on their performance, on the risk. And we tailor that obviously to each organization we assess, and we produce a rating. And it is off the back of that rating that action starts to happen. The rating really is there to identify strengths, but those improvement areas. We often act as an extension of sustainability teams, compliance teams, procurement teams to engage those suppliers on the topic of sustainability through that rating, through that report, by simply saying, look at all these things that you're doing really well. Look at all the strengths you've demonstrated. Here's a few suggestions on areas where you can do better. Through the platform, engage directly with Alyssa or directly with Melissa about the things that matter to BT or to Thermo Fisher. Make those small gradual improvements, because not only are they going to help you in keeping the business, but they will help demonstrate to other organizations that you are indeed taking this topic seriously. And on the flip side of that, teams like those of Alyssa or Melissa start to demonstrate the impact that they have on the supply base. Now, the tier N question is one that comes up very, very often. The truth is that the vast majority of companies are struggling with the tier 1 suppliers to get that visibility, to drive that impact, to drive that change. Others are attempting to go one step further, tier 2. But there again, the challenge becomes one of, all right, you have a solid relationship with a tier 1 supplier. In order for you to get to tier 2 or tier 3, in essence, you are relying a little bit on the transparency of your tier 1, on them actually saying, well, yeah, we do use those and those suppliers. And some categories, some industries are very open. Others are a little bit more cagey because that is their competitive edge. So AI tools do help, but AI tools are sometimes only as good as the input you put in there. So what we say is, look, make sure your house is in order first. Make sure that the ones where you have a direct relationship are in order then. And then start to have these constructive, sometimes difficult conversations about how you take that further into the next tier.
So I think that, if I look there, I think we've talked a little bit about the E and the S, and I'm going to go with G, and I'm going to change the G ever so slightly because I know it's governance. How do we envisage geopolitical situations that then impact governance activities? So we see this every single day at the moment with what's happening in our economic climate, presidential elections, etc. And Melissa, I'm going to speak to you from BT because I know your team work heavily in this. How are you managing geopolitical issues with your ESG requirements internally?
Okay, that's a loaded question right now. I think for us in our procurement team at BT Sourced, like conducting this due diligence and managing our risks with our suppliers and our impacts on our environment and society, it's crucial to our business, right? And it's not only the sourcing part of the risk, it's also in terms of the contractual obligations as well, and in the real-time risks as well. So the geopolitical risks that we're experiencing right now, and in terms of how all our suppliers are being affected. So here we really rely on like tools, especially when we're making sourcing decisions. And I think here our teams, we really need to have information real time about all of this, and it's important, like we rely on digital platforms like Trust Your Supplier, like EcoVadis. We also have different platforms as well, in terms of real-time risks and looking at rating agencies as well. So how they provide this information and how we use that information in terms of our sourcing decisions and in terms of how it informs our strategic sourcing decisions going forward as well, especially around diversity in our suppliers. So all of that is very, can I say, those tools that we use is very important because that kind of frames how we strategize going forward in terms of sourcing.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we very rarely talk about, is that multi-dimensional aggregation. It's where it's information not just from the likes of EcoVadis or other tool sets, because each of those have an impact on our environment and how we're actually managing our supply chain. I can quite easily talk about diversity or HEI. Cybersecurity in itself is also something that we critically need to be aware of when we're talking about ESG. Can I ask, either of you, how do you see cybersecurity and AI, which has no boundaries, by the way, there is no, country boundaries in that. How do you see them related to your ESG strategies going forward? And Lazar, maybe I'll start with you. And how do you feel that we need to interpretate that information within, a platform such as EcoVadis?
Two observations on cybersecurity and AI. So cybersecurity, data privacy, information security is, again, just like sustainability, top of mind for all organizations. There's no RFP, RFX process that you're going to go through where there isn't that as a major element. Very often you're about to win some business from an organization, and here you go, 150, 200 questions on cybersecurity, because it is that important to the business. We need to know what data you're going to use from us, where you're going to store it, how you're going to transfer it, how you're going to process it or control that data. Because it is really data that defines individuals nowadays. You are pretty much defined. You are an individual in cyberspace as well as in real life. So that's extremely important. How it's related to sustainability, it's interesting because a few years back, we surveyed a lot of our clients, asking them, okay, EcoVadis has been focusing on sustainability for the last 10 years. Cybersecurity is coming up. Some of our clients are saying that it is part of sustainability, some are not. What is your take? And should we, as EcoVadis, enhance our service to include cybersecurity, or should we do something separate? And they kind of said it's a little bit of both. So now, as part of our work, we do ask questions of all the organizations that we rate around responsible information management. It is critical, and it is usually linked to ethics and fair business practices. But we also realize that the topic is much, much broader, much more, it requires a lot more consideration. And so one of our sister companies now specifically looks at cybersecurity and doing cybersecurity assessments, because the level of importance is just so great, even though it is linked to sustainability. And the last point you made around how's that linked to artificial intelligence, it's almost like, okay, so we just spent this time finding out ways to be a lot more secure. GDPR's come up. There's puppy in South Africa, a bunch of other pieces of legislation and regulation, and now all of a sudden the AA comes in and throws it almost into disarray. How do we manage that? It is very difficult. Not a lot of organizations have set still the right boundaries around it, but it is absolutely, I believe, and what we're seeing, it is absolutely linked to not so much sustainability, but the responsibility part of sustainability. Doing business responsibly means you have, again, your house in order from a cybersecurity point of view. You need to be able to demonstrate that. Otherwise, you're unlikely to win any business.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one. And Melissa, from a technology organization like BT, how do they envisage the links between AI, which people say are, not necessarily environmentally friendly, as well as cybersecurity? How are you measuring and managing that today?
So cybersecurity is one of our very, very critical risks. And in terms of our risk platform that we use currently, when we look at risks every day, we have a cybersecurity platform that feeds into our tool where we get all the risk alerts coming through. So here, if there are specific cybersecurity risks that are coming through on a specific supplier, then that feeds back into our buyer, and then we act on that. So we have that from a tool perspective. And then we also have in terms of our group, our intelligence threat team that also looks at our business overall in terms of cybersecurity. But it definitely, can I say, I see it also feeding into the ESG portfolio as well. Cybersecurity risks, like it has so many different impacts as well in terms of GDPR and data and all of that. And it's all about being responsible technology that we use. And it all comes down to that in terms of our suppliers and expecting our suppliers as well to have good infrastructure around their cybersecurity and making sure that their networks are secure as well. So I think it has a lot of impacts. So it definitely would also maybe fall within the ESG side of things. Also in terms of like the whole corruption and bribery and all of that, it probably feeds like between the G and the social.
What is the strategy for DEI, responsibility within Thermo Fisher today? How are you measuring that, especially within those, ES and G? How are you doing that? And I'll look at Alyssa for that.
Sure. So we have a couple of different DEI initiatives. The first, of course, being supporting a culture of belonging for our colleagues, right? We have a large global workforce. And so the biggest and most direct influence we can make is with our own colleague population and really enabling them to build a sense of belonging, have a sense of inclusion here at Thermo Fisher. And we do that through our HR programming and our diversity power, specifically around generating strong business resource groups that really allow people of certain affinities to come together across the company in new and unique ways to drive business outcomes. But then we also have an active supplier diversity and small business program. And this is really similarly to the work that my team does to extend our environmental and human rights sustainability objectives down into the supply chain. The supplier diversity program does the same, right? And this is really about growing access to our supply chain for small and diverse companies and making sure that they can participate in the economic growth that comes from servicing large corporations. And to do that requires, making sure that we can get out to those small businesses, that we can work effectively with them, that we can make sure they understand where they can play and operate. But there's also a large data and reporting component that comes along with that program as well, making sure we understand if those suppliers are certified as small or diverse businesses. How can we track that to the goals and objectives of the procurement community more broadly? And I guess one of the things that I'll say to try to tie this all together a little bit is we just talked about cybersecurity, we talked about environmental sustainability, we talked about human rights, we talked about diversity. And I think the reality and the most challenging, but also the most exciting thing about being a sustainability person is the scope is ever growing, ever changing. And it's forcing companies to think differently about our data. Are we in silos? Our people and our ways of working, are we in silos? And when I think about that, I think about the challenges that our suppliers are going through. What is the supplier experience when you're getting one tool for a privacy survey and screening, and one tool to validate these risk events, and another tool to assess your environmental management platform, and another tool to certify your diversity status? We need to make this doable for suppliers if we expect them to get value out of it. And we just all talked a lot about driving impact and driving value. That's only achieved when the supplier is clear on the expectations we have of them. They understand how the suite of digital tools and solutions fit together, so they understand what they're being asked to participate in, and that they understand who at the company they need to be working with on these initiatives. When you work in a really big company, you're going to have lots of stakeholders as a supplier. We need to make it easy for suppliers, and this is something that, I think we're hopeful about when we think about the future of supplier information management, is that we're going to have more and more and more expectations and more topics to cover. That's just the reality of living in a complex global world. And yet, we need to make it doable for these suppliers to have an experience that's cohesive, that's repeatable, that does not, for instance, if you answer something for Melissa, you shouldn't have to come back and answer the same thing for me 2 weeks later. It should scale with the organization. So I think that's an exciting prospect. It's, of course, trying to build the plane as it's flying, like many of the things that we do. But I hope that we'll be able to envision a future where there are best of breed digital technologies, there's best of ways of working across companies, but that they come together in a cohesive way so the supplier can understand, again, what's expected from them and how to make a difference with the smoothest possible supplier experience.
And I take that, because by the way, I think it's really important that we talk about a system needs to be intuitive, informed, it needs to educate, but it also needs to drive a network of information from the supplier, as you say, across, different buyer communities, so that they have that shared experience, that shared knowledge at all times. I think that's really important. Melissa, if I have one thing I'd love to ask you. BT are very, very good at this. It's really important for them to drive education, but to also have a very shared platform, so that suppliers are engaging once and entering their information once. So Melissa, if you can just, Melissa, I told you I'd get that wrong. Melissa, can you tell us what BT are doing similar to what Thermo Fisher are doing to try and drive all of that together?
Yeah, no, sure. I think from our point of view, right now, it's important that we have this one platform that we can engage with our suppliers. And I think in terms of this, we're using TYS right now, and it's important because we send out various questionnaires to all our suppliers to understand exactly how they're managing certain risks, and then we score them in terms of their performance. And in terms of our entire due diligence process, this is part of, can I say, the responsible sourcing as well, just trying to get their information. And I think using platforms like TYS in conjunction with, for example, other rating agencies like Dun & Bradstreet, like Compliance Catalyst, together we can come up we can actually come up with the scorings, and this helps us in terms of how we manage the suppliers and where we could actually help suppliers and help them to focus on certain areas as well in terms of their performance.
Lazar, I'll ask you a final question. What is happening in the world today? What do we need to be aware of? There is so much going on from a regulatory perspective. There are so many elections this year. We've talked about geopolitical. What would you recommend to our listeners that they should be focusing on for 2024? And how could EcoVadis help us?
There's a lot of regulations. There's a lot of new asks. And it is quite common for organizations, when they see this, to want to tick boxes pretty quick. Say, all right, regulations coming up. How do I do the bare minimum? Okay, that one's done. Oh, there's another one here. Okay, how do I do the bare minimum? And almost like we were talking earlier, almost stuck in this sort of box ticking exercise where you think you're doing something just to either comply or just to meet all these regulations, but actually you're not doing much. You don't think about the bigger picture, which is, okay, how do I make sure that the business is future-proof, that it's resilient, that our clients will continue to want to buy from us, that our suppliers would continue to want to work with us. How do I do that in a sensible way? Because the cost of inaction is too high. Yes, there's geopolitical risk. That's almost the one where it's harder to influence, apart from if you are able to participate in the elections or local elections. The regulatory landscape, though, is only going to become more and more busy. And because it's going to become more and more busy, it's important to think, okay, if it is going to become more and more busy, what are the things that I can do now to make sure that when this new regulation comes about, I am ready. I'm demonstrating that I'm already doing enough. If not enough, even more. But to not be stuck in this, just fearing regulation, because that's going to just push you to tick boxes without doing anything meaningful, without having the right impact, without definitely doing enough. So it's kind of almost trying to think, how do I spin the upcoming regulations, the upcoming demands from clients, from suppliers, from investors, from talent that I'm trying to attract? How do I spin this in the best possible way, come with the best foot forward, and really demonstrate that I am a responsible company, a responsible individual, a sustainable company, sustainable individual?
It's good to talk, right? It's important to educate, and it's important to drive understanding throughout your own organizations and throughout your supply chains. I just want to say I really enjoyed this conversation. The three of you are extreme thought leaders in this area, and as an organization, I really appreciate you joining the podcast today.